Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a jazz musician who is involved with the organization Jazz for Peace. His work for Jazz for Peace was featured in the book Paving the Path for Peace Through Music by Deborah R. Serratelli. His name is Rick DellaRatta, and my interview with Rick will follow the note-taking sounds. Rick DellaRatta, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Aaron. Thank you so much.
You are involved with Jazz for Peace. What is Jazz for Peace and its mission, and how did that organization get started?
Well, it started on the morning of 9/11 due to the fact that I was living less than a quarter of a mile away from the World Trade Center in a 5-floor walk-up, and I was on the 5th floor. And so when I got tipped off about it by a photographer who had a job on Wall Street, that something was strange was happening at the World Trade Center, I simply just ran up on the roof, which was, like I said, the next floor above my apartment was the roof of the building. And I went up on the roof of the building, saw the incredible goings-on, and while I was watching them, words started coming out, and I started just kind of purging words onto a piece of paper. When the day was over, all I had to show for it was a bunch of words on a piece of paper, which after reading them, I decided to call the poem Jazz for Peace. And living up to that poem has led to our mission of over 850 concerts around the world to help the world's most outstanding causes, instrument donation programs for children and adults, education programs for the schools, and now all kinds of amazing things that are coming that people are talking about now that Jazz for Peace is trying to assist with by it being our world travels, trying to help heal our world with information that we've learned from these 22 years of just, traveling all over the world.
Deborah R. Serratelli wrote a book about you and your work with Jazz for Peace, and it's titled Paving the Path for Peace Through Music. Without spoiling too much of that book, what is it about, and did you have any involvement with the book's writing or production?
Well, I oversee everything at Jazz for Peace, and what happened was when ChatGPT came out, one of my friends was talking to me about it, and he said, Rick, you should really write a book. You can use this ChatGPT, and it'll get information from all over the internet when you ask it questions, and it can help you compile the things you need to have the book. And then I happened to notice that one of our volunteers had this little app called Genie, I believe, on her phone, and she was telling me about how, the same thing my friend was telling me. I said, well, listen, and this volunteer coincidentally had once written an article about Jazz for Peace. The article called Jazz for Peace, A Convenient Truth was published on All About Jazz, which is a major portal for people who are interested in the art form of jazz. And it was published on there, and it got over 12,000 views, maybe even more by now, but at the last I looked at it. And, most articles on All About Jazz, they get a few hundred views, maybe a few, maybe six or 700 if you're really lucky. And she got over 12,000 with this article. So putting the two and two together, I just said, listen, a friend of mine was telling me the same thing. And did you know that, someone could write a book about something much easier by using this to gather the information and then perusing the information and deciding what to choose to use and all that kind of stuff. So naturally, she put her ability to write a really successful article for Jazz for Peace into her ability to, utilize that app for the information that she wanted to gather and put together an amazing book. I did oversee it, and I also wrote the foreword. And the foreword I wrote is a very unique perspective on Mozart. A lot of people have been fascinated with Mozart since the movie Amadeus, and I have a perspective from an artist's viewpoint. And people have been interested, and even my 2 pages have created interest. A podcast came out a couple weeks ago from the beautiful National Park of Zion in Utah, and this person did a podcast about the foreword to that book. So the book has garnered a lot of attention. I've been very proud of the results.
Deborah volunteered for Jazz for Peace. What was Deborah like as a volunteer for your organization?
You know, she came to a concert in New York City that was being held in the basement of a youth hostel. And she, I think, stayed for a couple of shows. And she said she was just shocked at how much passion we put into our music on one of the shows, which had, hardly any people in compared to the other show. I think maybe it was the Late Show. Not really realizing that, if you're really passionate about music, you almost don't really care if anybody's there. You are 100% interested in, making the best music you can with that opportunity. And so she was so impressed with that she, started talking about volunteering and helping out. And of course, volunteers are very important. I learned this early on from a United States senator who was also a military veteran. His name was John McCain. And he wrote me a letter once just saying he wanted to commend the staff and volunteers of Jazz for Peace for their amazing work and their, the passion they put behind it. So I'll tell you, it's a great, anytime you have an opportunity to put a volunteer's passion with a need that you might have, and if you can combine both the passion of the volunteer with the need or interest of something that needs to be done in your organization, that is a magical equation.
Do you plan on, or are you considering writing a book or books of your own? And if so, what are some ideas that you have for any books that you will or may write under your own name?
Well, what I'm really coming across right now are solutions to problems. There's no shortage of problems in our world. So there's a bull market of problems and there's a bear market in solutions. And in my journeys, I've come across things that I believe would solve so many of our world's problems if they were only implemented. And right now, I'm in the process of taking certain types of segments from other podcast interviews and putting graphics behind them and putting screenshots and pictures to help people understand these ideas that I really believe would make a profoundly positive difference in healing our planet and our world and our people.
Go ahead and play the interlude.
Okay, you got it. What I'm going to play for you now is actually I get requests from volunteers, and sometimes they're seasonal. Here we are in, I believe, the second or third day of April. It's actually April 3rd, and one of our volunteers asked me to welcome the month of April to our listeners and podcasts with an old song called April in Paris. April in Paris.
How many albums and songs have you performed as a jazz musician, and what are some of your more notable albums and songs?
Well, I have 7 albums as a jazz musician, and I've written I've probably written 50 or 75 songs. I've never even counted them all. Instrumental, vocal compositions, different styles of music. I've even had a symphony composed. I composed a symphony, which was recorded. It was a symphonic piece, an orchestral composition recorded by the London Symphony Orchestra at Abbey Road Studios in London in 1999. No one could ever reprise. I never knew the charm of spring.
Are you a songwriter, and if so, how many songs have you written?
How many songs have I written total?
Yes.
Maybe I would say 80 or 90.
Okay, what is your songwriting process like, and what are some songs that you've written? Do you write all of your songs, or do you write just some of them?
Well, the songwriting process, usually it's something that comes to me, and then what happens is, after it comes to me, I basically try to remember it, and then if I can get to a keyboard, I'll write it down, and then basically it's usually only a short little segment, so that's where the additional composition has to come in, when I have to take that little, how would you say, idea, and then develop it.
The biography on your website lists you as someone who is, quote unquote, one of only a handful of jazz artists who can make a successful musical presentation to a large audience without having to abandon the true art form of jazz. How would you describe the true art form of jazz?
Well, the art form of jazz is a lineage of improvisatory contribution that comes from literally thousands of great musicians. And it's basically an ocean full of contribution that the artist draws from, who are his own influences, and he utilizes that in order to create his own style or make his own statement. And at the time that was written about me, it was during a time when the music industry was having trouble finding a marketable jazz artist. And so rather than take a real jazz artist and try to get that person, a place in people's minds and hearts and really market that artist, they were taking other artists who weren't really jazz musicians per se, and had not really contributed to that ocean, and they were calling their music jazz and then marketing that. So, in other words, these were people who were, not really presenting the true art form of jazz. So, but the record label was, thought that they could sell records. And then you had other artists who were representing the true art form of jazz, but it was maybe hard for the general public to reach them. So my goal has been to use, my voice and my compositional skills and my improvisational skills to try and reach those people that may have only been reached by other artists that were maybe not jazz artists, but who the record industry marketed as popular and put the name jazz on them.
That dichotomy you described, there's an analog to that in the fiction writing world between genre fiction, which is usually the more commercially successful of the two. It includes romance, science fiction, fantasy, and a number of other genres like mystery and thriller. And then literary fiction, which literary fiction purists will consider to be the true art form of the written word.
You're right. It may happen the same way in literature, where maybe you'd have Shakespeare or Dostoevsky, who is an amazing author, and they might not be as popular with the masses as, let's say, a Stephen King or something. And so, it's sometimes challenging to merge, that sort of deep philosophical writing into maybe, something that's more popular with the masses. So it's a big challenge. But like I say, one reason I play something for 2 to 4 minutes is I try to give the listeners and you the opportunity to be the judge, to see if I'm communicating to you, see if I'm communicating the art form of jazz to you in my presentation or not. I mean, because that's what I'm trying to do. So that's why I usually play something from like 2 to 3 minutes on every show.
You, Lenny White, and Eddie Gomez form a jazz trio. How are you, Lenny and Eddie, able to form your trio, and what is it like to perform with Lenny and Eddie?
Well, basically, I was in an interesting situation where I was playing in a jazz club in New York City, and a person approached me and said he had this vision of me and Eddie Gomez, who was, an iconic bass player even at that time, playing together and how amazing it would be. And he kept talking about it. And finally, I said to him, well, listen, sir, I mean, sounds like an amazing dream, but you're being very realistic. I mean, do you actually know? Can you get in touch with Eddie Gomez? Do you know Eddie Gomez? And he said he did. He said that his wife was a singer in Paris, April in Paris, where the song is about. His wife is a French singer, and they have a place in Paris, and she hires Eddie Gomez. So I was in a situation in Hong Kong where a club had asked me if I could bring over some great American jazz artists to play with me in this club as special guests. I'd be playing, my regular night, and then we'd feature a special guest for a couple of nights with me. And I thought, wow, it would be great to have a bass player. And we contacted that guy, and he, gave my girlfriend at the time, Eddie Gomez's number, and she called him, and one thing led to another, and it didn't work out in Hong Kong, but Eddie's listened to my music, and he said, when you get back in New York, call me, because I want to actually talk to you. I've been listening to your music. So that's how me and him got together. And then one thing led to another, and one day I got a call from Lenny White saying, hey, I heard about this recording you're doing, what's the deal? And I was kind of like, I was like, oh my God. I said, well, it's happening such and such a day, and it'd be great if you could play on it. So it just kind of came together like that. And it's been an amazing ride with these two amazing musicians. Jazz for Peace has kind of, gotten in the way of it a little bit, just because I've had to travel to so many places to do philanthropic work and philanthropic related concerts. Some places I've had to go by myself or pick up musicians there. But we've played many, many concerts together, including the very first Jazz for Peace concert. Next year will be the 25th anniversary of that concert. It took place in Troy, New York, at a place called Troy Savings Hall. And people are wondering if, there's going to be some special plans made, for this 25th anniversary of what is now considered, perhaps the most significant cultural event of our time. So there might be some celebrations happening next year.
One final question. Other than Lenny and Eddie, who are some other musicians and performers you've performed with in the past?
Well, one of the first breaks I ever got in music was at 19 years old, when I became the MC, the opening act and MC for Dizzy Gillespie. And I guess it was maybe a couple of years after that I got a call from the Artie Shaw Orchestra to be their pianist. And we did numerous tours all across the United States in a bus, going from concert to concert to concert. And things like that. I've also played with a lot of other rock stars and pop stars and soul stars, and like one that comes to mind is the famous 1950s band, The Platters. And then individually, I've played with just tons of amazing jazz musicians, too many to mention, and all of them are people that the musicians know, but not so much the general public.
Rick, it was absolutely amazing to interview you. I thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's been a pleasure for me as well.
I hope to be able to interview Deborah Suratelli for a future episode of this podcast, and I enjoyed interviewing Rick for this episode. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.